right? So some people say, well, I'm a little bit stressed with work, but this is flying, this is completely different. Well, no, what typically happens is projection, right? Your mind is distracted, you're thinking about something else, it leads to a safety issue. You forget to run the before landing checklist, you forget to run the climb checklist, you forget to do something because you're distracted and have a high level of stress. So we're constantly, assessing, is this stress so great that it's going to, decrease my abilities to safely fly the aircraft? Alcohol, there's a saying, 8 hours bottled throttle. The FAA has established that from 8 hours before your last sip of alcohol, you cannot fly an airplane. They also established that 0.04 is the highest blood alcohol content you may have while flying an airplane. But when establishing personal limitations, you may establish, I'm not going to be flying unless I'm 0.00. So that's one of the things you may establish for yourself, which is probably a good idea. Fatigue, how many hours did you sleep the night before? When you first start flying, you're going to be required to have a greater attention to detail, just because you're not, used to doing some things. You have to think more. You have to actively be, making sure everything's going well. So if you don't get at least 6 hours of sleep the night before, are you going to go fly? Because if you're flying on, 4 hours of sleep, that could result in an accident. There have been a lot of incidents that have been directly related to pilot fatigue. Eating, this is one that, you want to make sure that you're well fed, well hydrated, and well nourished before going up for a flight. So you can, again, focus on what's important, which is the safety of the flight. When establishing personal minimums regarding weather, there's a lot of factors that we consider when we are creating these personal minimums. And these personal minimums are very dynamic. We're going to be changing them, from the time that you're soloing to the time you get your private pilot's license, to the time that you get your instrument rating, from the time you get, your commercial, if you choose to go down that route. So it's going to be based on total time, additional ratings. Are you proficient in safety programs such as the AOPA Safety Institute, the Cirrus Owners and Pilot Association? Are you active in attending seminars, going to, monitoring the COPA forum, investigating accidents? Are you part of the FAA Wings program? The FAA has a program that they highly recommend people join to show, a desire to maintain being a safe pilot. And they have courses online that you can take, and they have items that you can complete with an instructor, and you can get endorsed to saying that you've completed, certain different levels of the Wings program. Do you have an instrument rating, or do you just have a private pilot certificate? This is going to establish, are you going to go out when there's potentially a marine layer that's low over the coast, or the skies are broken at 1500? While that's considered marginal VFR, should you be flying? That's another question you may ask. What's your amount of experience in high performance aircraft and complex aircraft? Are you doing the Cirrus transition and you have 10 hours in the Cirrus, and you are just fresh off your transition with your local TCI or CSIP, and you decide it's a good day to go shoot some approaches, but you've never handled a high performance aircraft without an instructor in the right seat? Should you be doing that, or should you say, hey, instructor, TCI, CSIP, I want to go up with you. I want to practice shooting approaches down to minimums that I haven't done before in an aircraft that's quicker than I'm used to. Recency of experience. When's the last time you shot an approach? When's the last time you flew in actual conditions? When's the last time you flew at all if you're just a private pilot? Maybe you haven't flown for 2 months and you want to take your family up. Is it legal? Yes. Is it necessarily safe? Not necessarily. You want to make sure that you remain proficient in your abilities to fly as well. We also have recency of training experience on there. This one is a big one. There are, legally you fly once every 2 years and get your biannual flight review with a flight instructor. And that's all you need to maintain legal currency in order to fly. But if you are continuing to fly and you haven't done a training event in a while, and you're, trying to fly in, lower weather again, like the previous example, should you be doing that if you haven't had an IPC in 6 months and you've only flown with a safety pilot? So all factors that you may think about when establishing your personal minimums. What Cirrus has provided us is they provided us a tool. I'm going to go ahead and share the tool that they provided. And they show us how we can establish our personal minimums. So in the Flight Operations Manual and the Standard Operating Procedures, Chapter 1, it's the chapter before Standard Operating Procedures, General, it's going to ask us a bunch of questions. So let's just say you have been flying less than 2 years and you haven't had a training event in greater than 12 months, and your highest certificate held is a private pilot with instrument, and you're between, let's say, 200 to 500 hours. You've only logged less than 50 hours in the past 12 months. You have only less than 10 hours in a Cirrus in the past 90 days, and you have about 50 to 100 hours total, and you've done about 6 to 9 landings in the past 30 days in the airplane. So 100 hours or more in the avionics suite. Let's say you're new to the aircraft, so the answer is no. So right here, this gives us a scale of, we're an infrequent pilot. We don't fly very often, so your minimums are going to be, higher. So Cirrus gives us this tool to establish, okay, can I consider myself a frequent flyer or an elite aviator? So you can say, let's change this up. Yes, we have a lot of experience. We've been flying quite a bit. We have 250 to 500 hours. In the past 90 days, we've flown 30 to 40 hours. In the past 12 months, about 150 to 200. Total time is 1,000 to 2,000. We have our commercial rating already. Less than 6 months since our last training event, and we've been flying for 2 to 5 years. So you can see how it dynamically changes over time from the time that you get your first solo to the time that you move up even further to become a commercial pilot with instrument. We also have this tool for IFR minimums. So let's say we've been flying 2 to 5 years. In the last 90 days, we've flown 5 to 10 hours of instrument time. Instrument 1 to 3 hours in the Cirrus. We've done 1 to 4 approaches with autopilot in the last 90 days. Hand flown approaches, we've done 1 of those. Received avionics specific with the CSIP, let's say greater than 12. And let's say we have 100 hours of more in the avionics suite. So you can see how this affects our personal minimums when you're considering your IFR minimums. So we have this tool, and I encourage you to go play with it to see, now what would your personal minimums be? If you're considered an infrequent pilot, you may say that unless the skies have a broken layer above 5,000 feet, I'm not going to be flying going out on a cross country, so on. I'm going to go ahead and move this back over here. Do you guys have any questions?
So Nick, when you're doing your personal minimums on the Cirrus app, you can do it on the iPhone, right? You said. So when you're doing that, and when would you necessarily go back and redo your minimums? How often do you change up your personal minimums based off your experience in the aircraft?
Definitely. So I would recommend about every 30 to 60 days going back and reevaluating your personal minimums. Or when you're starting to feel more comfortable and you feel, hey, I set this limitation on myself and I feel comfortable doing this now because I've had experience with an instructor, or I've had, some real life experience to where I didn't have a choice. The weather rolled in and, my alternate airport was closed and I had to scope out the situation, and I actually felt very comfortable in that situation. So in those types of situations, the best course of action would be to go consult your CSIP or TCI and ask them, hey, this is what I'm going through, and I want to start increasing my personal minimums. What do you think? Your CSIP or TCI is going to be able to give you a pretty good recommendation of what your personal limitation should be based on your experience.
And when you were training and becoming a pilot over your course of like your flight instruction that you got, how did you set your personal minimums without a tool like that? And why is the Cirrus approach to it so much more effective than, let's say, something that you would do in a Cessna or a Piper?
Yeah, without a tool like that, it was pretty hard. It was, based on my gut, which isn't a great way to establish personal minimums. I'm sure you can attest to the same, Brian. When you're learning in another aircraft that doesn't provide you such an advanced tool like this, it's hard to really establish that. I could go consult my flight instructor and he would help me some. But really, it wasn't until I was over about 200 hours that I was really confident in my abilities to go handle pretty much any situation.
Right. And then so now that you're a professional flight instructor in a CSIP, and we've talked about this off of a discussion forum like that. We have personal minimums based off the aircraft that we fly to, because we are flight instructors on top of CSIP. So sometimes we might get into another airplane, and when you're setting the personal minimums from there, they're going to be different than how proficient
Absolutely.
you are in this series. So how do you differentiate between the different types of airplane you're flying, and what are something that you're looking for to maybe have a little bit greater personal minimums?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I love about the Cirrus is the avionics are so advanced and they're so reliable that I never really question whether something's going to fail on me or I'm going to be able to get into an airport. So with my recency of experience out in Knoxville at the factory about 2 months ago, and my recency of experience out in Carlsbad the past month, we've gotten some pretty low weather. I've shot quite a few approaches down to minimums. So I've reestablished my personal minimums again. And these change every few months, especially for instrument flying. When the marine layers first started rolling in, there were times where I said, hey, we're not going to fly today because the layer is down to minimums. And so the way I kind of eased myself into those shooting approaches back down to minimums was, okay, start with a ceiling that's 600, 500, 400, 300, then down to minimums.
Right. So last discussion on Tuesday, we had a presentation on aeronautical decision making, and we did dabble on personal minimums. And we talked about ADM Reimagined, where we broke down the segments of each flight into 15-minute intervals. And we talked about how you can even have personal minimums for these 15-minute intervals. So, for the students on this call today that are planning cross countries and who are getting towards that part of their training, or who are looking to become better pilots, what's something that you're looking for when you're planning, like, let's say, a longer cross country with ADM Reimagined and breaking it down in those 15-minute intervals? What are you looking for to make sure your flight goes smoothly?
Say again, what was the question?
Sorry. So we talked about ADM Reimagined last week, and we were just looking for what your personal minimums along the route of flight that you're taking are, if you break it down into like 15-minute intervals.
I got what you're saying. So these intervals may be as simple as what kind of airspace you're flying through. Do you have experience flying through Class Bravo airspace? Are those 15 minutes? How busy is that going to be? What is the weather like in there? Are you flying in completely open airspace, or are you flying in mountainous airspace? Terrain clearance.
Right. So you're looking to make sure that you're keeping your terrain clearances. And if you're not familiar flying through Bravo airspaces, you want to make sure that, if you're flying it through a busy time and there's a lot of traffic going on and the approach control is sending you all over the place, you might get behind the airplane. And, you talked about not flying high performance aircraft very often. So when you learn to fly in something that's not, 315 horsepower, things come at you a lot faster. So you need to make sure that you take that into consideration when
Absolutely.
you're defining your personal minimums.
Absolutely.
So how do you guys, when you think about that that IFOM guide, there's, it's not overly specific. It's just more kind of buckets, and it gives you a resulting score. And then there are personal minimums, some of which we've been talking about here and some from the other day. that are quantitative, and then there are some that are qualitative. You know, how do you start to marry up that assessment grid with some of those other quantitative and qualitative factors that are much more specific, much like we've been talking about here?
That's a really good question, honestly, because the flight operations manual doesn't specifically say, you know, you're an infrequent pilot, here are what your personal minimum should be. Really, the best way to do it would be to take that chart, take your results, your TCI, your local CSIP, and say, hey, this is what I scored. What are your recommendations for personal limitations for myself?
Yeah, and when you're setting your personal limitations when you're learning to fly, if you look in the back of your logbook after you solo and you're for your cross countries, there's limitations that your flight instructor sets that are the conditions that you can go fly in as a student pilot. So when you start to become more proficient, you can start adding on to those limitations and use that as your first baseline. When you first go solo for the first time, you might want to take a couple knots off of it after you get your license, and then kind of work your way up. But it also depends on how proficient you are. If you're flying directly after your check ride, you don't have to necessarily change your limitations because you've been flying a lot. But if you get your check ride done and then you don't fly for a month or two, that's a different time frame that you want to take into consideration, because remember, flying has a lot of muscle memory. So using the Cirrus guide and the IFOM is really good, but at the end of the day, your personal limitations come from you. You can consult your TCI, you can consult your CSIP and your flight instructor. You need to make sure that you understand what they're telling you so you can continue to build off of what they've taught you the further into your flying time you get. They're always constantly changing because you become more proficient or less proficient. And that's that is a good question on how to use our tools that Cirrus provides us to our advantage. And I think that Nick did a really good job explaining what Cirrus does. And, for the pilots who fly other airplanes or learn to fly other airplanes and have transitioned to the Cirrus, there's no other company that gives you a guide like that with different levels of proficiency, so you can make your decisions. Like Nick says, when you're learning to fly or when you have an airplane, it's a lot of your gut feeling. There's the published, demonstrated components for the airplane for, crosswind and what it's certified for. But, the airplane could be certified for known icing, but you might not have done your icing awareness course, so you're not certified for known icing. That's a minimum that you need to take into consideration. And then if you haven't flown the airplane in a while, you might not want to take your family up right away until you become more comfortable with it. So, and then another thing to consider is if you're flying out of a club like Palomar Aviation, they also have flight operations manuals that generally fall in line with what Cirrus recommends, but they might have different minimums for the airplane as well. So you want to consult all of the documentation with you while you're establishing your personal minimums, because it might be a legal minimum, but as we discussed last week, VFR is a very low minimum, but flying in 4 miles of visibility is not the safest or smartest thing to do. So I just wanted to thank Nick for the presentation. It was a lot of great information on personal minimums and how to establish them, as well as some really good information on the Cirrus IFOM, which you can get on the iBook store on your iPad. It's what we use to train our students at Palomar Aviation, because it's what Cirrus used to train us at the factory. And that's how all Cirrus pilots in the professional world fly these airplanes, because it's the right way to fly them. Justin and Sherry, thank you for joining us. I hope you got most of that presentation. We'll be back Tuesday with another one at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 Eastern. And you could always download the previous episodes on our website at palomaraviation.com on the Zoom link. And if you ever want to get some instruction via FaceTime or Zoom, we can help you out at Palomar Aviation. So I just want to thank everyone for their time. My AirPods just died, so I hope you guys can hear me. And I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you very much.